move to a couple of presentations from our very own World Maritime University students. The first is Mr. Ambrose Yankey. He's got a distinguished career already in the Ghana Navy before he arrived at WMU to undertake his Masters in Maritime Affairs with a specialization in ocean sustainability, governance, and management. It's been a pleasure working with Ambrose over the last year and teaching him, but in particular with respect to his dissertation research, which he came up with the original idea of undertaking research in his home country of Ghana. He was particularly interested in the small-scale artisanal fisheries fleet there, and he's going to talk to us today about some of the insights and from his research. Please, Ambrose, welcome.
Thank you very much. Good morning once again. I wish to first thank the sponsors and organizers of this year's Catfish Workshop. It has been very insightful for me. And I also want to thank Professor Nate most sincerely for the opportunity to present my work to you, august audience. Well, so my presentation is titled, Examining How Ghana's Fisheries Co-Management Policy Could Tackle IUU Fishing in the Artisanal Fisheries Sector. And to build my story, I'll touch briefly on IUU fishing. I'll highlight the state of Ghana's fisheries and Ghana fisheries management with emphasis on the artisanal sector. And then I'll also touch on some key elements which I believe could be harnessed or improved to make our new co-management policy effective in tackling IUU fishing. And I'll follow with my research results and discussions. Well, by way of introduction, a lot has been said by previous speakers on IUU. I will not bore you with figures and statistics, but I think it is important to re-echo that fish is the most traded food commodity and it's essential to the economies of nations, especially developing nations. And of course, IUU fishing is responsible for much of the world's overfishing and depletion of the fish stock. The figures are staggering, as you can see on the slide, with loss of over $23 billion yearly. And so it's important we talk about this. Now, the state of fisheries in Ghana, my country is a coastal nation in West Africa with about 30 million people. We have a very rich biodiversity, but development is not very even in the regions. The southern parts are more developed or urbanized, the southern regions, and because of that, there is rural-urban migration to that side. And so it is estimated that about 40% of the population dwells in the coastal areas. And there are about 200 coastal villages that are littered along our 550-meter stretch. And this has potentially increased the rate of exploitation of our marine resources. Our marine fishing industry comprises of the small-scale fishing, or the artisanal, which I'll be talking about. We have the semi-industrial and then the industrial subsectors. And about 10% of our population relies solely on the fisheries for their livelihood. The sector also generates some money, which is important to our economy, and fish also play an essential role in the nation's nutrition and food security. Like many West African or many developing coastal nations, IUU fishing is widespread in Ghana. We have been warned twice in the last decade with the yellow card, which was talked about yesterday. But the yellow card simply also means that our effort to deter and stop IUU is not sufficient. And there's also scientific data to prove that our fish stock has declined significantly. And as a result, Ghana has become a net importer of about 40% of our nation's fish requirements. So combating IUU fishing is therefore imperative for us, for our fisheries to be sustainable, considering the potential challenges of climate change on world food security. Now, in the artisanal sector, our artisanal sector employs traditional fishing techniques for basically commercial and subsistence reasons. We have these small canoes, some are motorized, some are not, and we use very basic nets for fishing. The major species that are landed are the small pelagics, and there are a staggering 13,000 canoes operating in our EEZ. Literature says that we need only about 9,000 if our fisheries is going to be sustainable, but there are about 13,000 of them. The total annual catch of our canoe fleet was about 254,000 metric tons in 2014, which was more than what the industrial fleet landed. But this has seen a downward trend due to negative impact of fish spawning, on fish spawning and breeding arising from increased fishing effort and a rise in IUU fishing activity in the sector. So this is a picture to help you appreciate how our sector looks like. But I also want to mention that previously the artisanal sector was deemed sustainable and non-destructive to the fisheries because they just go get something small, can feed their families. And so legislative instruments and enforcement efforts did not largely target them. They targeted the industrial fishing fleet. So for example, even now, the artisanal fleet is supposed to be registered or licensed or given permits, but they are not. So what it means is that, Professor Bomla, you can sit here in Sweden and just send some money down to somebody to get you a boat and they start fishing for you. So this has really increased the fishing efforts and the number of canoes on our waters. So because of the increase in fishing efforts, some artisanal fishers have resorted to illegal means of fishing, because of the competition. And so we have people fishing with undersized nets, explosive chemicals, and other unapproved fishing aggregating devices, which has actually led to the depletion of our fish stock and also contributed to the degradation of our marine ecosystem. Additionally, artisanal fishers are habitually unreported because of the poorly regulated and widely dispersed landing sites or landing beaches where we land our fish. So they actually fit the definition of IUU, which is illegal, unreported, and unregulated. Now on Ghana fisheries management, we have a legal framework. There we have the Fisheries Act of 2002, which outlines the legal framework within which our fisheries are to be managed. And we have a fisheries regulation, which supplements the act. I'll just touch briefly on that. Also, there's good interagency cooperation and stakeholder collaborations between the Fisheries Commission, which is the apex body at the operational level for fisheries management in Ghana. They collaborate well with the Ghana Navy, the Ghana Air Force, the Ghana Ports and Harbour Authority, the Ghana Maritime Authority, a lot of NGOs, and a lot of fisheries organizations. So if there are all these interagency collaborations, there's a legal framework. The question is, why then does IUU persist? And this is why. Like I mentioned, we have not been able to successfully register the artisanal fleet or giving them permits. So because of that, there is open access to their resources. The dynamics of artisanal fishing has changed from being a subsistence way of living to an aggressive attempt to generate profit. People are building bigger boats, trying to increase their endurance at sea with technology. In fact, they have, yesterday, Dr. Ife mentioned that some fishers are even sighted at 50 nautical miles. And I have cited some even at 60 nautical miles in our coast. So they are going beyond and that is why it is important. So if giving permits is a way to regulate, why haven't you been able to do that? And this, one of the main reasons is because of poverty. Poverty is strongly linked to IUU. And like I mentioned, we have over 200 coastal villages. And these villages are characterized by high rate of unemployment high population density, and poverty. And because this poverty has not been effectively addressed in these communities through government interventions or provision of alternate livelihoods, previous governments have not been able to, or they've avoided taking that critical step to restrict access to the fisheries, because they've not been able to provide jobs. So why then do you now stop people from also going to sea, the only means where they can have some livelihood? So this lack of political will to issue permits or licenses in an effort to regulate the sector has further aggravated the challenge of IUU fishing. Now, on co-management, Ghana has the traditional regulatory approach, which is the top-bottom approach, and it has not worked. And so co-management is the way to go. The FA on Pomero defines co-management as a partnership arrangement between government and the local community of resource users, sometimes also connected with agents such as NGOs, research institutions, and other resource stakeholders to share the responsibility and authority for management of a resource. Because of this, Ghana was inspired to adopt a co-management approach in the form of a community-based fisheries management committees. It took some successes, but it also failed to meet its objectives due to challenges of clear legislative framework and also lack of administrative clarity to attract the interest of key stakeholders. And this is where my research comes in. I was trying to look at what was lacking, what can be done so that the new fisheries co-management policy could potentially help prevent IUU fishing or combat IUU fishing in the artisanal sector. So to do this, I coined out some essential elements which I deemed was important. And I was inspired by Elena Ostrom. You see, in the 19th century, the tragedy of the common theory became very popular, which implied that the privatization is the only means to protect finite resources from depletion. So, but Elena Ostrom discredited this theory after a comprehensive work on managing common pool resources. So she came up with some principles, 8 of them, which has been well validated by both literature and case studies. So this is a diagram I created myself to try to link the 5 themes that I wanted to discuss with Elena Ostrom's principles. So I'm looking at influence and power sharing in our co-management arrangements. I'm looking at whether stakeholder participation was adequate, whether there are issues of trust between the resource users and the government, whether the level of compliance is sufficient, and whether there's level of education or the awareness is also sufficient. And I tried to do it there. So the object of my study was to investigate how these elements I have mentioned, which are inherent in Ostrom's principle, could be harnessed or improved in the new Ghana Fisheries Co-management Policy to effectively tackle the menace of IUU fishing in the artisanal sector. Of course, it's a social science experiment, and it was therefore a qualitative research. I did some literature to set my background. I conducted semi-structured interviews. My interview questions were based on my 5 teams. And my choice of respondents were very experienced chief fishermen with an average experience of about 10 years. And also I was able to interview some state officials from the Fisheries Commission, the Ministry of Fisheries and Aquaculture Development, and some officials from the Ghana National Canoe Fishermen Council. Yes. Because of mobility issues and I couldn't reach most of the chief farmers, I recruited one young man to assist me in collecting my data, and so I did an inter-rater reliability. This is the young man in black. He's called Samuel, and he took a picture with some of the chief farmers he interviewed. So to ensure that my interview and his interview were on the same basis, I gave him some training, and then I gave him an orientation so that he could conduct the interviews to reflect my objectives, the objectives of my research. So, like I mentioned, I interviewed only fishermen and the state officials. And so that could be the limitation in my study, because I didn't focus on NGOs or other external factors. And this diagram is to show the vertical link between the local resource users. I did that on the premise that the most important element of co-management is actually the government and then the local resource users, although the external factors are important. So all my results, my results focused on evaluating the 5 elements I mentioned and how they could be harnessed or improved to combat IUU fishing in the artisanal sector. I looked at influence and power sharing, stakeholder participation, issues of trust between the resource users and state officials, level of compliance, and education and awareness. This table shows an example of some of the supporting quotes that I had from the teams, and I'll be discussing them vis-a-vis with my results. And so, for instance, with influence and power sharing, some of the chief fishermen were quoted to have said, and I would explain. The quotes A are for government officials, and then the B's are for the fishermen I interviewed. So B1, or one of the fishermen, said that they, which is the government officials, see, and I just try to maintain the originality by quoting them verbatim. So that's what you see on the screen. So they see we fishermen as third-class citizens, and they do not regard us as much. But interestingly, one government official said that these fishermen are well organized at the national, regional, and district level, and they were able to prevent the close season from being rolled out in 2018. So you can already see the disconnect. The fishermen think that they are nobodies, but they're actually powerful. With stakeholder participation, my research found that it was adequate. So the definition of co-management forms the premise that indeed the people who rely on the natural resource are the people who should actually be central to decision making on how this resource has to be managed. And so if the local resource users are not empowered, then there's no co-management at all. So from the results, and as I showed you in the quotes, there is a bit of disconnect in the issue of influence and power sharing. For example, fisher groups from the district and national level were able to mobilize and successfully resist the close season measures that was introduced in 2018. It was after an NGO or an external agents came in, trained some other fishermen in something called a fisher-to-fisher dialogue, and these fishermen went back to talk to their other colleagues before they agreed to their close season, which was now implemented effectively in 2019 and is still enforced now. And this actually shows how powerful these fishers are. See, meanwhile, some of the local fishers hold a view that they are seen by the government authorities as third-class citizens. And as part of my recommendation, these contents must be, and misunderstanding needs to be addressed if our new co-management policy is to succeed. On stakeholder participation, my research found that it wasn't adequate in the past, but now stakeholder participation has been brought in adequate in the new policy. Notably among them is the inclusion of women in the fishery supply chain as part of stakeholders. So now they are involving women in decision making, although they are not actively fishing. also the Office of the Attorney General and Ministry of Justice in my country, some more academia institutions, and other associations, as you can see on the slide, have also been included in the policy. On the issues of trust, which is very important, the fishers strongly feel that their interest is not protected by the government. In fact, my research, we found that some of the artisanal fishermen engage in IUU fishing simply because they feel that the Chinese trawlers come into the 30-meter zone, which is reserved for them, trawl, and then the government officials do nothing about it. And so they feel peeved, and then they feel disadvantaged, and so they also resort to using small mesh size and other illegal means to fish so they can also survive. And indeed, one state official confirmed that the level of trust was low and must be improved. So this disconnect on the issue of trust also must be diffused through transparency and effective communication. The new co-management policy must therefore seek to build and improve on trust to not only increase the sense of co-responsibility, but also improve compliance and encourage responsible fishing in the artisanal sector. On the level of compliance, the research revealed that compliance was not adequate. Although co-management has been shown to potentially improve compliance in the long term, enforcement of the regulation is also necessary to achieve high level of compliance in the short term. Back to my table, some were quoted to have said that if only they had police posts at some of the landing sites, then this IUU will cease. So both the fishers and the state officials or the government officials actually alluded to the fact that enforcement was one way to go to deter IUU fishing in the sector. It was also a general consensus that punitive measures were insufficient to deter perpetrators of IUU fishing, and so they could look at increasing fines or penalties for violations as a way of rectifying the issue. I found something interesting. Because I interviewed fishers along the entire stretch of our coast, we found that the level of compliance was high at the eastern coast of Ghana as compared to the west coast of Ghana. And it was the simple reason that in the eastern side of Ghana, they have very defined and well-regulated fish landing sites. Whereas at the west side, the landing sites are poorly regulated. So more of like a post-states measure agreement sort of thing is happening at the east side, and then it is absent in the west. On level of education and awareness, the study review. So with this, I wanted to find out how much aware these fishers are on the consequences of IUU, firstly, and also on the benefits of co-management. You see, because it's one thing acting in ignorance and another acting knowingly. And it was interesting because most of the fishers actually were aware of the implication of IUU fishing, and they affirmed that it was the lead cause of decline in the fish stock. But they said they couldn't help it because they also had to survive because of the stern competition between them and then the industrial fleets. See, most of the respondents also agreed. In fact, all the respondents agreed that the benefit of co-management has been widely publicized through workshops, festival games. They usually have these festival games in the coastal states, and they have radio programs and other community-based social marketing methods has been. So they are fully aware. And because of that, in fact, some of the fishermen are eager and they are looking forward to the implementation of the new fisheries co-management, and they actually anticipate a greater influence and authority in the management of the fisheries. However, like everywhere, education and awareness creation must continue, since Firstly, the artisanal sector is very dynamic, and there are yet some fishing villages where capacity building efforts are yet to reach. So to conclude, which is also some form of recommendation to my government, we concluded that the new co-management policy should include a formal guidelines for the devolution of both power and responsibility from the authorities to the stakeholders. Otherwise, it will just be on paper, but in reality, it will still be the top-down approach where laws are made by the higher authorities and pushed down on the fishers, because they will now find these regulations as being imposed on them, and so it will also reduce compliance. And fisheries dependent stakeholders should be part of decision-making process and vested with the necessary powers to implement those decisions. And it was also recommended as part of our conclusion that much greater attention needs to be paid to garnering trust among stakeholders, as this is essential if the outcome of the co-management policies are to be achieved. It's also imperative to improve the level of compliance with the set laws and regulations governing the fisheries by increasing enforcement and monitoring control and surveillance, and increasing presence at sea also. And finally, the value of education and awareness building cannot be overstated, as they empower stakeholders and foster mutual respect between management and resource users. Thank you very much.
Ambrose, very interesting insights that you've gained, and I'm particularly impressed that you could gain access to these chief fishers throughout the coastline. I'm sure there'll be a few questions from the audience. We've got time for one or two. Dr. Okafor Yarwood at the back, please.
Thank you so much for the presentation. I learned so much listening to you, and I genuinely do not have any question in relation to maybe pointing out anything, rather than to say, I hope you get an opportunity to publish this so that actually we can read it and so many other people that are interested in the research can read it. One thing I want to ask then, however, relates to some of the things you mentioned, and is specifically in relation to gender, right? Where are the women in these discussions? Even though in your, providing the result, you sort of said something like they are not directly the fishers, right? But I wondered, did you actually engage them in the spirit of this co-management thing we're talking about? Especially if you take into account that some of these women actually own the boat the fishers are using to fish. Thank you so much.
Thank you. If I got your question right, my research focused mainly on I just wanted to know the fisher's perspective and the state officer's perspective on IUU fishing and co-management. Because of the direct link between them. Yes, the women are actively involved in the fish value chain along the line, but it's a limitation in my study, which I think I can look, or other researchers can look in the future. But thank you for mentioning.
Further questions? Oh, sorry.
Thank you so much, Ambrose, for a well-done presentation. My name is Zenia Ponyula from South Africa. My question is regarding the IUU persisting in terms of just the actual environment. In your presentation, you mentioned that there's a high level of, this is the result of a high level of competition, right? Among the fishers themselves, maybe artisan and also on the commercial level as well, which naturally presents threats to the actual industry, because if we're looking at it from a sustainability perspective, right? My question is, in your opinion, based on your findings, which main elements, actions, or resources can be considered to maybe sort of promote sustainable use of resources outside the regulations? So maybe you mentioned the level of awareness on an educational perspective, but in your opinion, what else have you identified maybe as a gap that you think can maybe be prioritized to maybe ensure a higher level or a better level of compliance and cooperation amongst these fishers in that specific community? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you for your question. I would say two. One is the introduction of permits, which will sort of bring some sanity or regulation to the artisanal sector. Like I mentioned earlier, research has shown that we need only about 9,000 canoes if to fish in the artisanal zone if it's to be sustainable, but we currently have 13,000 and counting, because day in and day out, very greedy investors are taking the opportunity to invest into that fisheries, and the open resource or the open access is one big challenge. So I think introduction of permits is one way, but also I think it should come with the provision of alternate livelihood. See, so because if you are saying that people should not fish, then there should be something else they could do. So government intervention is also very much needed, and it all goes down to education and awareness creation, because if people are better educated, then they'll be better informed to make better decisions. Yeah. I hope it answers your question. Yeah, thank you very much.
Yeah, very well said, Ambrose. Okay, just in the interest of time, I think we should thank Ambrose once again.